Open your books to A Life of Freedom. We're almost done with our text, and we'll get started with our warm-up. It says, how do you think the lives of slaves will be different now that the Civil War is over and the Union won? Go ahead and write down 3 to 4 sentences. How do you think the lives of slaves will be different now that the Civil War is over and the Union won? Press pause as you write down your answer, and then play when you're ready to begin. As always, we are going to find the main idea of the text, and we're going to do that by asking a how or why question about the title. Before we get into that, we're going to preview our vocabulary words. These words are going to be pretty important in our understanding and in our writing. The first word is bondage, and that is a synonym for being a slave. If you are in bondage, you're also a slave. Number 2 is refugee, a person who's been forced to leave their country in order to escape war, persecution, or natural disaster. So if you are escaping your country, you are a refugee. And last one is opportunistic. We see the word opportunity in this. Those are people who exploit chances offered by immediate circumstances without reference to a general plan or moral principle. So it's like taking advantage of the situation. You could be considered opportunistic. Draw a line from each definition to a picture. And then we need you asking a how or why question about the title to help us find the main idea. Our title is A Life of Freedom. And so I'm thinking, I know that this is about slaves, that slaves were experiencing freedom. So I'm thinking, how did slaves experience a life of freedom after the Civil War? How did slaves experience a life of freedom after the Civil War? You could also ask, why did they experience a life of freedom? But we already know from past chapters that it's because of the Emancipation Proclamation that set all the slaves free, and also because the Union won the war and they were fighting about slavery. So we do know why they have freedom, but we are going to read this chapter to think more deeply about how was their life free? What about their life was free? Remember, as I read aloud, you're going to underline the answer to your question, and that's going to be our main idea. So you need your book open, ready to underline the answer to the question. After more than 200 years of bondage, America's slaves were freed when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Congress was passed in December 1865. Across the South, Black Americans wandered the countryside looking for a new start. To deal with these estimated 4 million people, the government set up the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency that housed, fed, and educated refugees. And in this case, refugee is a synonym for slave. Meanwhile, or ex-slave, we could say. Meanwhile, opportunistic Northerners called carpetbaggers tried to gain the political support of freedmen, who now had voting rights. Many ex-slaves returned to their former masters' plantations and worked there again as poorly paid employees. Others helped rebuild the South to make it a good home for their families. Go back in the text. How did former slaves live a life of freedom? Well, our text says They wandered the countryside. Well, that doesn't sound very free. And then it says, okay, well, the Freedmen's Bureau house fed and educated the refugees. That sounds a little like freedom. I got my own house, I have food, and I'm getting to go to school. These opportunistic northerners called carpetbaggers, they try to take advantage of the voting rights slaves had. So that doesn't sound like freedom. Although voting rights is an aspect of freedom, so we can add that. The Freedmen's Bureau house fed and educated the refugees. They got voting rights. And it says, but many of them returned to their former masters and worked as poorly paid employees. And then some helped rebuild the South. So it sounds like a life of freedom for ex-slaves after the Civil War. Sounds interesting. Sounds like they didn't have a place to go. So they could get housing through the Freedmen's Bureau, or they would have to go back to their master's plantation and work there for little money. But some were able to make good homes for their families. How can we put this all together in a main idea? Well, we could say just after the Civil War, many slaves were house fed and educated by the Freedmen's Bureau. And some even went back to their masters to work as poorly paid employees. I think those are the two biggest ideas in our text right now. So write that down as your main idea. Press pause if you need to, and then play when you're ready for box 2. It says, how did Black Americans respond to the 13th Amendment? Okay, we'll go back in your text where it says, American slaves were freed when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Congress was passed. And in the next sentence, it tells us about Black Americans. Across the South, Black Americans wandered the countryside looking for a new start. So that's how they responded. They wandered the countryside looking for a new start. They wanted to leave their plantation, but many of them actually didn't have a place to go because they weren't allowed to own land and they didn't have any money because they weren't paid as slaves. Press pause to write down your answer and then press play for part 2. How did the government respond to the 13th Amendment? Well, if we keep reading, it says, to deal with these estimated 4 million people, the government set up the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency that housed, fed, and educated refugees. That's our answer. The government created the Freedmen's Bureau that housed, fed, and educated refugees or ex-slaves. Press pause to write down your answer and play when you're ready for box 3. How did the Northerners respond to the 13th Amendment? Well, let's keep going in our text. Meanwhile, opportunistic Northerners, okay, so we know they are trying to take advantage of this situation, tried to gain political support of freedmen, and that's referring to Black Americans who now had the right to vote. So we know Northerners or carpetbaggers tried to get the African Americans' vote. They moved down to the South and they tried to use the African Americans to vote for them and get them power politically. Press pause to write down your answer and play to get started. the inference says, what does the name carpetbaggers suggest about what people thought of them? Well, carpetbagger seems like a pretty negative term. I would never want anyone to call me a carpetbagger. Doesn't sound very positive. And so if carpetbagger has this negative connotation, it probably means that people had negative thoughts about them. And we know they did because they were trying to take advantage of the Black Americans that could now vote. Press pause to write down your answer and play to get started. And number 4, why do you think many ex-slaves returned to the plantation of their masters? That should say masters. Okay, well, let's go back in our text. It says, many ex-slaves returned to their former masters' plantations and worked there again as poorly paid employees. I'm going to have to go back to the beginning of my text to help me answer this question. It says that the Black Americans wandered the countryside looking for a new start. Well, that means that after they wandered the countryside, many of them came back to their masters, and that's probably because they didn't have any place to go. They went back to the plantation of their masters because they knew how to farm. That was a job they knew how to do. But if they're just going out into the world without having a job doing anything else, it was hard because people didn't want to hire them. Because all they had done was farm. And then moving around costs a lot of money. And we know they didn't have a lot of money saved up. They couldn't own land. So there wasn't a place for them to stay. So many of them returned because they didn't have a place to stay. No one else would hire them, and they knew how to farm. They knew how to farm. So they went back to their plantation. And then last it says, how does the author describe the life of freedom for African Americans after the Civil War? So you need to come to a conclusion. Was their life of freedom what they expected it to be? Was their life of freedom this joyous, positive experience? Or was their life of freedom not what they expected? Was it disappointing because it wasn't everything that they expected? After you make your decision and write down your main idea, you need to follow up with some details from the text. Go ahead and get started.